Well, I'm very pleased to be joined now by Peter Dunn, who is the CEO of Your Moneyline and the host of the Pete the Planner podcast. Thank you very much for joining us here on GBN America. Look, we live in incredibly, difficult economic and financial times for a lot of people. I know a lot of people will be wanting to know how on earth can they stabilise their finances. So have you got any tips for them?
Absolutely. And it's a pleasure to be with you. You know, in 2020, when the world sort of shut down around COVID, we were all forced to re-examine our financial lives. So we had this great motivation, fear, that caused us to make some really good financial decisions. So Patrick, to your point now in 2024, we don't have anything quite hanging over our head like COVID, but at least in the United States, we've got a presidential election, which also could coincide with a constitutional crisis. A person should feel more motivated than ever to take control of their personal finances. And I hate to say it, it starts with a budget. It is the best place to start, especially in uncertain times.
Okay, so look, what are the best ways for people to budget, especially if they've got a mortgage to pay, maybe they're paying off a car, they want to put a bit of savings away as well. There's a lot of high interest rates flying around at the moment. So how can people not just keep their heads above water, but actually put some stuff away for a rainy day?
Most people should look back on the last 90 days of spending and see what they have spent, and then just classify those categories. This is what I spent on housing. This is what I spent on groceries. This is what I spent on transportation as a starting point, because some Americans are going to find out that what they're currently doing isn't good. And so you got to start there. And then at that point in time, you've got to start to budget in savings while also reducing some transactions that we've become accustomed to over the last 3 or 4 years.
What about debt? Should people be prioritizing paying off high interest debt, or actually should they not be doing that at the moment and maybe wait for it to subside a little bit?
Great question. It really depends on how high of interest we're talking about. As we all know, global interest rates have come up, and that's to suggest that a mortgage at 7% right now in the United States isn't the worst thing in the world. So I wouldn't hurry up and pay that down. However, if you've got a credit card debt at 29, 30%, that is something that you would want to aggressively pay down. So it is all relative, knowing that mortgage rates in our country were a few years ago at 2%. Just because they're at 7 or 8 now doesn't mean that you need to aggressively pay down that debt.
Let's just have a little look at some people who might be, fortunately, slightly better off. People who are looking to invest, okay? So not your super wealthy, your average Joe who's got a little bit of spare cash. Maybe they've come into some money and they're wondering about where they should put that to get a lot of return on that investment.
Yeah, I think it has to do with defining your goals and identifying what you're trying to accomplish. Most novice investors would say, I want the most return that I can get. Give me the highest return, when in fact that's kind of a bad idea, because it won't help you make a better investment decision. For me, I'm happy with 8 to 10% annually. Does that make me a boring person? Arguably, but that's a different question altogether. But I would say it allows me to make better investment decisions. So if you got money to invest, don't just say, hey, I want this to be the most it can be, because that actually makes investing harder.
Yeah, that is interesting. Is that about the level, do you think, that people should be aiming for? If they can make about an 8% increase on what they've got in their investments, do you think that's the kind of target that people should be looking for?
Absolutely. Usually I hedge on an answer like that. I wouldn't say absolutely, but I mean it. 8 to 9 to 10% is a great rate of return on average. It means you're going to double your money. You're going to double your assets every 9 years or so based on that return. And I know that we want to get rich quick. The cryptocurrency and Bitcoin has us feeling like we're all going to be crypto millionaires overnight. But the reality is, if you can double your money in 8 or 9 years, that's amazing. And you can do that with an 8 or 9% rate of return.
You mentioned a little bit earlier on about the upcoming election and what that may or may not mean. Obviously, we can't predict the future, but I'll just ask you the same question for both potential winners, I suppose, really. If Trump does get in, who could it benefit, do you think? And what potential problems could there be? So both sides of that coin.
Sure. I think the stock market will continue to rise. Here's the thing. Under Trump's presidency, February 19th of 2020, the market had reached an all-time high. Well, it kind of happens almost every presidential administration. So that has happened under Biden too. So I think with Trump, you'll see that the stock market continue to rise. I think you will see geosocial unrest in the United States to some degree, depending on if there is a constitutional crisis leading up to that. If President Biden is reelected, I think, again, you're going to see the market rise. But I think you're going to see the government go deeper into debt from a budgetary standpoint. That's not to say I prefer one or the other, but I think no matter what, you're going to see the stock market continue to rise due to these economic conditions. And it's just how many jobs are created, I think, could be the difference between the two administrations.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just ask you to focus a bit more on Biden now as well, then, when it comes to that. So, you don't really think, by the sounds of it, unless I misinterpreted what you've had to say there, it doesn't sound to me as though you're predicting a huge economic shift one way or the other, depending on who walks into the White House in the new year.
I think the only large economic shift we're going to see is if there is a constitutional crisis. I think if we get to a point where it's in doubt of who won, you're going to see some really bad effects of that. Otherwise, I think the trajectory of the economy is determined at this point, and certainly the stock market as well. I don't see massive growth coming on the tails of either of those two gentlemen winning.
Could I just ask you one final one? It's a little bit left field, this, but I think the way that things are here in Britain at the moment, there can often not be, with incredibly high tax, an incentive for people to go and start a bit of a side hustle. They think, well, I'll have to get out of bed earlier in the morning, I'll have to put more work in, and I might get taxed at, say, 45% of that or something. And so they think, well, there's not that much of a point doing it. What's the situation like over America? What would your advice be to somebody who's looking to top up their basic income by starting some kind of side hustle? And what kind of areas would you recommend they maybe go into?
I love that question. Thanks for asking it. I still think the side hustle is alive and well here in the States. People still really value that. I will note that tax is not a disincentive here in terms of a side hustle. If people want to do that, number one, there's so many things like food delivery or Uber or Lyft that a person can do. That's sort of what people have done in the last few years. But of course, I would encourage people to see if their own professional skills combined with AI can create a job opportunity for them that way. I think that will be the next 5 years, is side hustles will be driven and supported by AI, not just delivering fish and chips to your neighbor because they don't want to go out and pick it up themselves.
Peter, thank you very much. Thoroughly enjoyed that. And I do hope to talk to you again very soon. That's Peter Dunn there, the CEO of Your Moneyline and the host of the Pete the Planner podcast. Thank you very much for joining us on GBN America.
My pleasure.